Today on the TMZ Podcast.
Welcome to the TMZ Podcast. Jason and Derek here. How you doing, Jason?
I'm well. Today's a sad day because
Yep.
we're going to be honoring a number of people whose lives were lost during 2022.
There's always a little bit of, it's a bit macabre to put these lists together, but I wanted to give people a sense of what we're looking for to make this list so that we don't dishonor other people who passed away in 2022, to give you an idea of how we actually rank these to the extent we're ranking them. The first thing we're looking for is what's the shock level that the death sort of has, and a lot of that is related to someone's age, basically, whether they passed before their time, whether the circumstances of their death were sort of strange and not in the ordinary course of how someone typically passes.
We're trying to come up with, we're doing lists of 5, so the 5 most relevant, I don't know what the right word is, but the 5 biggest deaths of 2022, and Betty White, although a huge death, doesn't necessarily make the cut because she was 100 when she passed away.
Yeah, also passed away in 2021, so she wouldn't have made the list anyway. But
by way of
yes,
example,
yes,
December 31st. She was so close.
Late December. Yeah, she nearly made it.
Yeah. So did that sort of thing.
That's
about
the basic
how shocking
idea.
It was. Right?
Yeah, and the other criteria is sort of the public's response, and we measure that basically by how the story did in our world on the website. Was there a lot of engagement? Was there a lot of sharing it? Did the people in the office feel sort of a powerful reaction to that? And that doesn't always line up with sort of the biggest celebrities on the tip of your tongue, and it's sort of surprising what celebrities' deaths do particularly well in terms of traffic on a website versus their level of fame.
So we're going to do a bit of an in memoriam here, just listing respectfully as we can the folks who died this year, but whose deaths didn't necessarily shock the world, but they were nevertheless enormous stars who passed away. Why don't you go ahead and start us off? The biggest star of them all?
I mean, that's Olivia Newton John.
Oh,
who would you say? Oh, Queen Elizabeth II.
QE2.
QE2. Obviously, her death doesn't fall in the realm of the unexpected. She was very, very old, lived a long, good life, but certainly passed away this year. It's thrown the royal family into flux. You got Prince Charles elevated to king. Obviously, that family's in some disarray, but that was a huge, huge deal.
The one most near and dear to my heart, somebody I grew up with Vin Scully, the great longtime Dodgers announcer and one of the great human beings in the history of sport, passed away. Again, like QE2, he was 94. QE2, I think, was 96.
But he'll be. I mean, you can't watch a Dodger game without thinking it's time for Dodger baseball. So huge loss there. And then we'll give you a list. Angela Lansbury from Murder, She Wrote. Mikhail Gorbachev, huge political figure in Russia during my childhood. Olivia Newton John, as I mentioned. Ken Starr, the guy who prosecuted the Bill Clinton in various ways.
Former partner at the law firm that I cut my chops at. When I arrived, there's Ken Starr down the hall from me.
He's
quite a thing.
He was the dean of Pepperdine Law School as well.
Years later, the dean of Pepperdine Law School.
Jean-Luc Godard, huge, sort of new wave cinema guy. Louise Fletcher, who is Nurse Ratched. That's really her biggest role, and she's sort of iconic if you're a film star, if you're a film fan. Loretta Lynn, the coal miner's daughter. Jerry Lee Lewis, Great Balls of Fire. So some very big, important people, but a lot of them older.
Irene Cara, another huge television star from the 1980s. Huge musician from the 1980s as well. Chris McVie, other musician, right?
Very big deal from Fleetwood Mac. And then a couple that I have who didn't make our top 5, but what were sort of surprising deaths, Coolio being one of them. Yes. He was a massive rap star in the 90s, died in some sort of, some strange circumstances. Suddenly, I would say. He died of a heart attack at a friend's house. He was in his 50s. This was a big death that sort of sent shockwaves through our newsroom in particular, because even though not top of mind, Coolio is one of those guys that was just in the background. He was always very friendly to our cameraman, and it was a big loss.
Few people who have a moment who shine quite as bright for a moment in time as Coolio did with Gangster's Paradise. #1 song, the #1 movie. He was everywhere. Had such a unique style with the hair twisted up and everything. And he was just for a moment as big as anybody gets.
Yes, and then I'd be remiss not to mention Leslie Jordan, who during the pandemic in 2020 emerged as a huge star of that moment, right? Yeah. Because of his engagement on social media, he would do these little videos that sort of put a smile on people's faces. He also had a lovely acting career as well, but his loss was pretty profound because he was driving to, film a show and had some sort of medical event in his car and careened off the road and died suddenly. So that was a very, very sort of shocking death. And in other years probably would have made our list, but we wanted to mention them as well at the top.
So for this year, applying the two criteria that Derek laid out, the shock level and the public response, there are 5 pretty clear sort of most zeitgeisty, most relevant deaths of 2022. Let's start out with who we said is number 5. No particular order
here. Yeah, exactly. Don't take these orders as gospel.
Yeah.
We're not going to really debate who should be ahead of who because it gets into some morbid territory, but these are the 5 most impactful deaths of 2022 in our opinion. The 5th one is...
And the most recent by far.
The most recent, but he didn't just make this list because it's recent. He made it because it is a shocking death and really sent shockwaves through our newsroom. Twitch boss, Stephen Twitch boss, who was the longtime DJ of the Ellen DeGeneres show, just a well-known figure for his positivity. That show involved a lot of dancing and guests, and he would just radiate sort of this charisma that people were really drawn to. Had a career in dance before he had this sort of DJ role on the Ellen show, and he may not be a name on the top of your head, but because of the way he passed, which was by a self-inflicted gunshot wound, he went to a motel and took his own life. This story is still developing at this time. There's a suicide note involved and things of that nature, but it really was profound because it was very unexpected. This guy on social media presented a very, very happy image, had a wife, 3 young children, just a very sad story.
Yeah, a couple things about this. Number one, because it happened so recently, this is the one death of the on the 5 that we're going to mention that is not, the facts aren't as well developed. We don't know exactly what happened. We know how his cause of death, certainly, but we don't know why. There's still some blanks to fill in. Number 2, I think it is his, you and I, we talk about this often, other people in the newsroom, when something big happens, somebody dies, a big marriage, whatever it might be, people reach out to us, friends, family reach out to us. I don't know that I've ever had the response personally that I got with Twitch's death. I had everybody from my mother and her friends to my kids and their friends.
Across generations.
65 years of age difference, commenting on the sudden loss of Twitch and how sad they were because they were all familiar with him. To your point, he brought a great deal of joy and levity to every situation. He was a big dancer. He and his wife, I think they had met on So You Think They Could Dance, or they had appeared together.
I think the reason for these is even though he was not the star of the Ellen DeGeneres show, when you're on television every day, day in and day out, people develop sort of a parasocial relationship with the people on television.
Well,
and
we're on TV every day. Do you think anybody develops that with us?
I don't think there would be warm feelings. I don't think it would be the same response as Twitch got, but a very, very sad story, and that's why we had to have him on the list. I want to move to the number 4 spot, which to me is one of the most shocking things to happen in our newsroom. It happened late in the day, and that was the death of Heche. Heche had been sort of a figure who had a huge amount of celebrity. She was in a lot of movies in the 90s and early 2000s. She dated Ellen DeGeneres.
I think that's what she's probably most famous for, is her short-term relationship with Ellen DeGeneres. It was a different time, and 2 stars who were in a gay relationship wasn't quite as common as it is now, and it really created a lot of headlines. Ellen had recently come out, and her first, as far as the public knew, her first relationship with a woman after she came out was Heche. But she had her own moment of celebrity. She was in a few movies. She was in a big movie with Harrison Ford. I really like her in Hung. I don't know if you ever watched that movie.
Absolutely. She's great.
That television
Very
show.
talented.
She's really talented actress. Really tragic circumstances. I mean, she had struggled with substance abuse for a long time. There were videos emerging of her driving through the streets of L.A. clearly intoxicated. Eventually
speeding around erratically,
speeding in residential neighborhoods, eventually crashing into and through a residential home, going through a series of walls. A fire combusted. She was caught on fire.
She was trapped in the vehicle for a very long time, I think close to a half an hour in this vehicle, engulfed in flames. Ended up dying of smoke inhalation. Really tragic situation with Heche. And the outpouring, even though she had this very troubled life, things soften in death, and the retrospectives that were sort of in the media about her were about her, sort of having this, as you mentioned, public-facing lesbian relationship during a time when that wasn't that common. So, a lot of people had very fond memories, even though she had somewhat of a troubled interim in her life. Just a very, very shocking death, and had to have her on the list as well. So tell me about, in terms of shocking deaths, number 3 is also pretty high up there. Tell me about it.
So Aaron Carter, a musician, sometimes actor, beloved by a whole generation of kids. He's maybe a little bit too young for you and me.
Yeah.
But there are people in our newsroom, Courtney among them, who love Aaron Carter. Obviously, the younger brother of Nick Carter, of Backstreet Boys, and sort of had a career of his own that really looked like it was coming into focus. Again, troubled by tremendous substance abuse issues, in and out of rehab, lots of very sort of troubling behavior over the years by Aaron Carter. Eventually, that caught up to him. He died in his bathtub, and I guess the cause of death might be drowning. It may have also been an accidental overdose. He was clearly extremely intoxicated, as people who die in their bathtubs often are.
Yeah, and as you said, his impact on people just a generation sort of younger than us is profound. I mean, Courtney was devastated. She was truly in tears. This was as if sort of, I'm trying to think of an analog for people our age, like a Kurt Cobain level death, and I'm not really overstating it. She was very, very troubled by it, even though he was a figure who had battled these demons his entire life. He had a very troubled relationship with his family because of the substance abuse over time. He had rocky, personal relationships with women over the years, but he was a figure of he seemed to be sort of turning things around at this moment in his life, and it was really tragic. He's 34 years old, and he was trying to turn the corner. You could tell that he was, aging and wanted to, rehabilitate himself in some way. And it was just too late.
He had been so aggressive on social media for such a long time. He had really been saying things to tweak his family. All that had calmed, and it seemed like things were coming back into focus for him. Apparently not in time. Very, very sad death. Next is the youngest person, and I would argue at the time of their death, the most famous person, and that's Takeoff from the Migos. He died in a horrible shooting that happened at a bowling alley in Houston. He clearly was not the intended target. There was some sort of fracas that had developed at the bowling alley.
Over pickup basketball was part of the conversation.
Yeah, but apparently Takeoff wasn't even involved in that conversation, may not have been involved in the basketball game, but a bunch of people around, and some genius decides to pull out a gun and start firing randomly into the crowd. And Takeoff took 2 bullets and was killed at the scene.
This was one of the most pointless tragedies that I could imagine, because we've covered Anne Heche and Aaron Carter, who had troubled lives that were careening towards some sort of tragic conclusion if you were really watching them closely. Takeoff, it really came out of the blue. This was a kid who was 28 years old, celebrating, I think, a birthday party at a bowling alley when this happened. He was with his cousin Quavo, also in the Migos,
who may have been more involved
in the verbal altercation, but nevertheless, you listen to these videos that are on our website about what was actually being sort of discussed. It's all posturing. It's nonsense.
It's a bunch of kids sort of sticking their chests out talking about basketball.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden somebody pulls out a gun.
And someone pulls out a gun, they squeeze off the shots, and a life is just taken. Now, the reaction to this in the public has been very swift. This was a huge band. I mean, the Migos are, to rap, sort of akin to almost like sort of a Beatles level band. Everyone in the band is famous. Takeoff, Quavo, and Offset are 3 very famous individuals. Obviously, Offset married to Cardi B. These are towering figures, and they're quite young. I mean, that's what I was struck by. Takeoff was in his 20s, and now that I'm in my 40s, I look at someone who's in their 20s as they really haven't figured out life yet. Right. He had inordinate amount of success, obviously, but was still sort of just a young kid in the wrong place at the wrong time. And it was
there's going to be a lot more talked about next year about this, because the person alleged to have killed him, a guy named the 33-year-old Patrick Xavier Clark, has been arrested on murder charges. And again, the police reiterated that Takeoff was simply an innocent bystander who was gunned down in this senseless act of violence.
Now, the last death on our list in the number 1 slot is Bob Saget.
Yep.
Bob Saget was 65 years old, not nearly as young as Takeoff, but the circumstances of Bob Saget's death were something that we've never seen.
Yep.
We have simply never seen. He was touring, doing comedy shows in Orlando, Florida, and he was found dead in the beginning of this year on January 9th in his hotel room. The medical examiner sort of determined that he died as a result of blunt head trauma, which sounds like something you would, see on an episode of, CSI or something like that, as if he were bludgeoned. The autopsy
but found lying peacefully in his bed on his back. So the blunt force trauma clearly happened before, or at least the conclusion of the medical examiner, before he got into bed. But There's no sign of trauma anywhere in the hotel room. There's no blood, so it was really mysterious. But they do have him. They ruled out foul play because they have him, cameras showing him carting into his room.
Yep.
A couple of hours before he
took
died.
a photo moments before with a fan in sort of in front of the hotel.
So a lot of speculation about falling, hitting his head on the bathtub floor, hitting his head on the headboard, although it was padded. There might be a wood sort of trim on it.
Yeah.
Really, still unexplained exactly where the trauma was incurred.
Absolutely shocking. And in the world of stand-up comedy, he's a bigger figure than you recognize because everyone remembers him as the dad from Full House, but he also had this sort of second wind where he was just this filthy comedian. And he was very, very funny. He would go do Comedy Central roast.
Which ran so contrary to his Full House persona as the great dad who never said a crosswise word.
The most wholesome show of the 90s.
He was the filthiest comedian. And do you remember this? He came out as a filthy comedian in a cameo on Entourage.
Yes.
A few years after Full House is off the air, he goes on Entourage, and his character just plays this guy who has tons of hookers around and doing blow and the whole thing and just swearing. We're like, who is this? Is Bob Saget just doing this weird cameo? Turns out this is who he was from a comedy perspective.
This is who he was, and he loved to lampoon that old image. He played it to his benefit in terms of it would make you just blanch seeing, the dad from Full House, Danny Tanner, up there just spewing, spewing sort of curse words and disgusting stuff. He really trafficked in a lot of like sort of gross out type of comedy. He was on the movie The Aristocrats. You ever see that?
Sure.
The documentary about the old joke that everyone tells in a slightly different way. And his version of it became sort of legendary because it was absolutely depraved and filthy.
Yes.
And he is a guy who you may not have been thinking about in an everyday sense, but he fits perfectly in this list because everyone, the outpouring, the people from the 90s who knew him from Full House, the people in the comedy world like Jeff Ross and all of his friends in that have been absolutely devastated by his passing.
And just to build on that a little bit, we talk around here, not necessarily, I mentioned in Twitch that you and I got, at least I got the most sort of people contacting me, but in terms of the general outpouring of sadness, the traffic that the website generated, in terms of the big deaths in TMZ history, and there have been some big ones that we've broken the stories on. Michael Jackson's the first one that come to mind, but you have Paul Walker and lots of other folks who have died. Bob Saget ranks up there. I mean, in terms of the incredible traction the story got, the amount of people that were following it closely, the amount of people that were engaged in the story and had their thoughts about Bob Saget, one of the biggest deaths in the 16 years of TMZ.
Yeah, I want to say one more thing about him because the people on this list, he was a legendarily sort of nice figure. So all of the stories about Bob Saget are how generous he was with his time, how he'd be nice to fans, how he would help younger comedians along and put them in his shows and so forth. A lot of people on our list were quite troubled. Bob Saget, there are none of those sort of sharper memories or sort of reconciling sort of a public image with a sort of less savory side. He is just remembered in very, very fond terms.
He and Twitch are similar in that respect, and which makes their deaths so senseless. I mean, they're all
Takeoff as
might
well.
be the most senseless. How young he was and the nature of his death. Well, who knows? It's just, but yes, a genuinely wonderful guy who died way too young, as the other people on this list did.
Yeah, so that'll do it for us. Stay tuned for our next episode where we
big celebrity breakups of 2022.
Yeah, so
this should be fun.
Tune in for that episode as well.
Sad for the people, fun for us.
All right, see you next time.